Hi everyone, Tim the Plane Man here, and welcome back to Plane Time Zealot Binary Edition. So when we left you last, we just fired everything up on this active wiring diagram for the binary build, the Zealot build that's going into the Sonic model binary. And here it is, she's still running. We've got our motors running, we've got our retracts, we've got our steering and our servos, we've got our ailerons control, we've got our LiDAR, we've got our airspeed sensor. I also didn't mention, because it doesn't do anything, we have a GPS here as well, and of course the accelerometer is built into the flight controller. We have a Wi-Fi module, and we have our standard safety switch and buzzer, which is over here, and pretty much not doing anything right now, but that will be activated later. And the other thing that I did want to mention that I haven't included on the model yet is the video transmitter and camera for the for FPV. And although I have put a camera in here just for demonstration purposes, it's not actually live, I will do a separate video that shows connecting up the video transmitter to the Zealot, because it really is kind of impressive and looks good, and maybe I think it deserves a video on it all on its own. So we'll do that separately. Where shall we start? Actually, let's start with the radio, because that sort of drives everything from there, I think. Okay, so let's go have a look at the radio setup. Let's have a look at our inputs. So for my inputs, I like to use what the function is that I'm trying to do and split that out from what the output is, because I find that sometimes they're the same. Like, you know, what people often do is they say, I'm going to move the ailerons, and that goes through to the ailerons on the plane. But sometimes it's not really obvious that I'm going to say, I'm going to move switch B, and that's going to be my retracts. So what I've done is I've set up, as you can see here, I've set up that ailerons is set up as roll, which might be familiar to people who are coming from the quad world, where it's rarely you talk about roll as in what you want the vehicle to do, what's the function, versus ailerons, which is the control surface that makes it happen. What I want to do is roll the vehicle, so I move the roll stick here. Okay, and that's set up as my first input, and I've actually mapped that as roll as my input name, and I've mapped that and I've linked that to ailerons as my in the mixes. I have pitch. Pitch is this stick here, and pitch is mapped to elevator. I have throttle, my motors, which is throttle is throttle. I haven't done anything with that. And then I have yaw. Yaw is basically turning left and right, and on a plane you implement yaw by moving the rudder. So I have yaw mapped to rudder. So pitch is elevator, yaw is rudder. Then there's other options that are mapped through that are not control surfaces. So I have a throttle cut, which is mapped through to an arming switch. So a throttle cut, typically you implement that on the transmitter. It actually cuts the throttle channel, and it does that the way I've set it up on my controller. But it also sends an arm or disarm signal to the flight controller to tell it to arm or not to arm. I have flaps next. So flaps again, flaps I guess are flaps. So I've mapped flaps to flaps, and that's channel 7, channel 6. I've mapped retracts on channel 7. I've mapped my flight mode, and the flight mode is set up to use on the my TX16S. Flight mode uses, let's just see if I've got sound. Yes, I haven't put, so you can see that on the mission planner screen. It actually says stabilize, button 2, manuals, button 1, fly-by-wire A is button 4, loiter is button 5, auto-tune is currently set to button, auto-tune is set to button 5, and button 6 is return to launch. And I like to have button 6 as return to launch because it's my kind of save me button, my oh help button. If I don't know where the plane is, or if something it seems to be doing something particularly dangerous, I pretty much press return to launch and watch ArduPilot save me, and it has saved me many times doing that. So I've also mapped, and you see a couple more things here. We have pan and tilt. So pan is my left slider and tilt is my right hand slider. And that's all my inputs. Now if we go and have a look at our mixes, what we have is, as you can see, ailerons is, now I've just used the standard AETR for the mixes. So ailerons are channel 1, elevators channel 2, throttles channel 3, rudders channel 4. Channel 5 is required to be arming for express LRS, which is the receiver and transmitter that I'm using. And then I just mapped flaps, retracts. I put mode on channel 8 because by default ArduPlane expects it to be channel 8. It can be changed, but since that's the default, I went with the default. And then I added pan and tilt. So pan is channel 9, tilt is channel 10. I'm expecting to put a video transmitter power onto channel 11, and I have set up a switch for turning a geofence on and off. I'm not sure if I'm going to use it, but I've set that to channel 12. So let's see how that looks in Mission Planner, and we'll go back to the basics again, and we'll look at ailerons. Now the interesting thing about ailerons is straight away is you have 2 ailerons. Now I haven't used a splitter here. Let's go have a look at our servo output here, and this is really quite interesting. So what I've done, first of all, I've split apart the inputs from the outputs. So the radio expects to be AETR, ailerons, elevator, throttle, rudder, and then the other stuff that I explained. And I only need one output for ailerons, but by wiring this up with separate aileron outputs so that you can actually, for example, trim the aileron separately, independently, I have used 2 outputs for ailerons. And so somehow I thought when I did that, that I was going to use 2 channels for ailerons. Straight away it's going to be channel 1, servo output 1, servo output 2 is ailerons, and I've broken my AETR straight away. And then I thought, well, what I'd really like to be able to do is have my motors up front. And so I changed it up, and I did it very deliberately. So AETR, that's how the radio is set up. That's how the radio is set up. But in the flight controller, what I have is I've set throttle, because there's 2 motors. So there's 2 outputs, because technically I could set up differential thrust on the 2 motors. So throttle, throttle left, throttle right, and then there's aileron, because I've got 2 aileron servo outputs. Then there's elevator, there's only one of those. Then there's rudder, and there's only one of those. So now I'm up to output 6 already. Next is flaps. I don't have the flaps here, but there's 2 flaps, so I've put in two servos for flaps. Now I could gain myself another output by putting a splitter on the flaps. I'm not sure that I see the benefit in having 2 outputs for flaps, but right now that's what I've done. And what I've also done now is with RC in 7 is this is where it got interesting with how to map the outputs in ArduPilot compared to the inputs that are coming in. If you notice, the function on each one of the servos is actually set by a function. Throttle right, throttle left, aileron, elevator, rudder. ArduPilot understands what these inputs are doing. But when we get to 7, and 7 is my retracts, what I have effectively done here is said that my my output here for Retracts, which is Servo Output 9, is simply going to be a straight feed through of RC channel 7. And this is just a quick update to the video I just finished about setting up the whole wiring diagram for my awesome build of the Zealot H743 flight controller with the Sonic model binary. And this is it here. And what happened was, when I was recording it, I hadn't set up the retract correctly, and it bothered me when I was doing the recording. I mean, what I did is I set up a pass-through so I could control the retracts just using a switch on my but ArduPilot didn't know about it. So what I'm expecting is that I can control the retracts myself if I'm doing a manual takeoff and landing. But if ArduPilot is doing an automatic takeoff and landing, ArduPilot should be able to retract the landing gear when it gets into the air and then put the landing gear down again when it's coming into land. And if ArduPilot doesn't know what's going on, then it's not going to work. Well, as soon as I said goodbye, you know, to the plane man, over and out, blah, 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 I thought that bothered me and I had to go figure it out. And the simple answer is that there is a parameter, of course, in ArduPilot, it's got to be a parameter. And there is a parameter that I needed to enable, and the parameter is, and I'm going to pull it up right now on Mission Planner, and I'm going to show you this. So if I look at that in Mission Planner, and the parameter is LGR underscore, and it was LGR enable. So here you can see the parameters for landing gear, LGR, right? Took a little bit of figuring out to find it, but here it is. And the other thing that happens is, if you look for LGR, by default you'll find only one parameter, and that's this one here, LGR enable. And LGR enable is by default set to 0, and 0 is disabled. And when LGR enable is set to 0, all the other parameters are disabled and there's no landing gear functionality. Go figure. So what you do is change that to 1, write it to the flight controller. So I just double clicked, entered it, then hit the right params, and then refresh, because the flight controller updates. It didn't need to do a reboot, it was just a refresh. So write the parameters, do a refresh, and when it pulls back again, you end up with this full slate of parameters that you can set for landing gear, which weren't there before. And in particular, their landing gear options, number 3, which is to automatically retract or deploy landing gear in auto or guided mode. And also there's an option here for what's the altitude to retract, and I'm going to set that to 10 meters to be nice and safe. Actually, I'm not sure what the default should be. I'm not sure what 0 means, but if 0, then altitude is not used for retracting. Well, I'm going to use 10 meters from my altitude for retracting, and there's also a deploy altitude when you're coming down again, and so I'm going to basically use the same. It should be lower than the retract altitude, and so I'm going to make it 9. So that's lower, so I'll make it 9. So if it gets down to 9 meters, then it'll deploy the landing gear, and I'll write that to the flight controller. And the answer is, well, let's stop it from prompting me. I haven't changed in the date. And let's go get the refresh. And so now LGR startup confuses me a little bit, but I'm going to basically, because it says should it start to retracted or deployed, and by default wait for the pilot, so I'm just going to leave it like that on the and I'll let the transmitter deal with that, and my default switch will be for landing gear down, which is normally how I'd want it to be if the plane's on the ground. And to test it, whether it works in auto mode is going to be a little tricky, but without crashing the plane, but I'll figure that out later. But for now, what I have is, whoops, I just put that down. What I have now is, with that setting, I get the same function, which is my transmitter switch is away from me or off. The radio doesn't complain when it's turned on. That's retracts are down. And then if I set the switch all the way forward, the retracts go down or into the plane, so that's retracts up. And then if I'm coming into land, I'll push it back down again, and then the retracts will go down. So I think that I got that right now, and I'm not I would love to test that. I might have to see about figuring out how to set that up in Siddle, because I'm kind of nervous about that, and I want to make sure that it actually works the way I expect. I mean, I'm sure it works. That's not a problem, but sometimes it's not exactly bleedingly obvious how it works, and maybe you make some assumptions. So I'm gonna, like right now, I know that it works on the switch. I can put that landing gear down and I can put that landing gear up. What I don't know for sure is that I've set it so that ArduPilot will automatically put the retracts up or down when it's coming into land, and I would love to be able to test that in such a way where I don't have to crash the plane to find out I got it wrong, and but that will come. So a little quick update. I have now set my landing gear correctly, I think, by LGR enable and setting the altitude for deployment and retracting of landing gear to 10 and 9, and hopefully I now have fully functional landing gear. I know it works on the switch. So thanks for joining me for this quick little update. Now I have ground steering, on the other hand, is set up correctly. Notice that if I move the rudder, the yaw stick, the input is set to send that signal through to rudder, which is channel 6. But it will also go through here to this servo, which is servo 10, which is ground steering. The difference between rudder and ground steering is that ArduPilot is smart enough to know that once you're off the ground, and I think it's 5 meters off the ground, it will stop sending any signal through on the ground steering channel. So it will stop steering once it gets to a certain height, and stop. So I mean, I can't do that right now because I'm on the ground. But what should happen is once that plane gets a certain height off the ground, according to the barometer, then this servo will just stop moving. And then I can put the retracts up. And if I can figure out how to tell ArduPilot that those are retracts, then the next step will be that it will automatically be able to put the retracts up when it successfully takes off. And that will be awesome, but for now I just have it set as a pass-through. Now I also did the same thing with the pass-through for the pan and tilt. With the pan and tilt, there's a whole bunch of interesting information about setting up cameras with gimbals. ArduPilot does a lot of things about that, and is very smart, and can actually manage a gimbal setup with a accelerometer and a gyro that might, for example, be on the camera and basically stabilize the camera in flight. Ben Snote just did a video about setting that up with the Storm 32, I think it was, and it's really quite amazing. And I don't know, I'm doing a lot here. I'm not going to do that. So I'm just doing it simple, and it seems like ArduPilot doesn't care if you're going to do it simple. So there's no sort of standard camera, pan, camera, tilt, input, output. If you're going to do, all I could figure out, and again, maybe if someone else has some suggestions about this, but all I could figure out was if I'm going to do just basically manual control of my pan and tilt, then all I do, which is what I've done here, is I take my channel 9 from my radio input and I feed that through to output number 11, which is my tilt, and I take channel 10 from my radio input and I feed that through to output 12 on my PWM output from the flight controller, and that gives me my camera rotate. And all I've got is a fairly standard tilt servo. It's just a regular standard servo, and the pan servo is supposedly a 180 degree servo, which is clearly not 180 degrees. It might be 150. So not quite as advertised, but still probably good enough to start. To complete the story, I've explained pretty much all of the PWM outputs on the front of the flight controller. And just to run through it again, I have, here's the diagram. This is the diagram, so you can see along the bottom there's 1 to 8, and along the top there's 9 to 14. So along the bottom 1 to 8, I have throttle or motor, right and left. I have aileron, 3 and 4 is left and right aileron, right and left aileron. I have elevator coming in at 5. I have rudder at 6. I have flaps at 7 and 8. And I may scavenge one of those flaps by putting in a splitter. On the second row, the one at the top here, not full yet, but I start out with number 9. So number 9 is my retracts, and then number 10. So I tried to group them together. 9 is retracts and 10 is the steering, the landing gear steering. So that's number 10. And then 11 and 12 are my pan and tilt. And then I have 2 extras left over, and one of them is 13 is reserved for my video transmitter, which will be a separate video. And what I plan to have on that is servo video transmitter power output. There's another option for that, which I'll go into in the other video. Video transmitter power can also be set through a UART on this end of the flight controller and not use a PWM output. I kind of like the idea of using PWM just because I'm trying to avoid using UARTs, but if I really have to use a UART I will, but I just don't want to. So that gives me servo output 13, and then 14, like I think I mentioned, is going to be for lights. I plan to put there's 2 options here. I've got 2 different sets of lights. One of them I'll have a relay on it just to turn on and off, and the other one is a more sophisticated light system, also a little heavier, so I'm not so sure about it, but it's capable of doing, on multiple switch outputs, it can do different patterns, which I'm not sure I need. So one way or the other, though, I'll be having lights on channel 4 on PWM output 14.